Hello. In this second lecture, we will be looking at a comparison between biblical and Quranic verses on gender. Okay, so this is a study of Holy Scriptures and what they say about gender. Okay, and we are doing the comparison with the Bible, number one. Because we kind of continuing with the previous segment's theme, the Quran, of course, inherits a lot from both the Old and New Testament, but it also addresses the question of cultural relativism, and particularly the dominant narrative that there's something inherent in the Islamic faith that is oppressive to women. Is Islam patriarchal? Well, to answer that question, we have to situate Islam with the other three, within the other two Abrahamic religions, Judaism and Christianity. In theory, all three religions are following the legacy of the prophet Abraham, otherwise known as Father Abraham, otherwise known as the patriarch in all three religions. So by definition, in kind of a default, all three religions are patriarchal if they are the legacy of this singular patriarch. The question is, when we say, is Islam oppressive, we have to ask the question, is there something inherent about the Abrahamic faith that is inherently patriarchal? And then in this case, what does this kind of situation do? Well, then we understand Islam, Christianity, and Judaism as a product of a particular place and time. In other words, we understand all three religions as a product of an ancient Mediterranean setting that we've determined so far was patriarchal before there was a Judaism, a Christianity, and an Islam. In other words, we see some continuity. But then, as history asks us to do, is not only study the continuity, but change. What is different about Islam vis-a-vis Judaism and Christianity? Okay. So what I did is I took verses from the Quran. And if any of you read Arabic, I took the original Arabic because sometimes, well, a lot of times the Quran is written out of context, okay, or with the inability to compare the English translation to the original Arabic. We could say the same for the Bible. You can't understand how much gets lost in translation when we translate the New Testament from Greek into English. And keep in mind, for most of history, the Bible was translated from Greek into Latin, then from Latin into English. In other words, it got lost in translation for that reason. And I'll just give you an example of what gets lost in translation. The word apocalypse, for example, we think of apocalypse as fire and brimstone, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, right? The apocalypse in the original Greek just meant and this is why I'm bringing it up, an unveiling. Okay? And so why is this important? Because the notion of the veil existed in Christianity. In other words, an unveiling wasn't just referring to what a woman wears, but it's kind of also a metaphorical description of what covers also the believer of a man in Christianity. In other words, we all wear veils, right? One of the most controversial aspects of Islam is its allowance of polygamy. Now, let's put this in historical perspective. In the ancient Mediterranean, okay, so in other words, whether we're talking about from ancient Rome to ancient Persia, there was no limits on how many women a man could marry. There existed an institution that basically was unlimited. Remember what I said of Alexander the Great? Marrying 365 women because the Persian emperor he deposed also had that many? What did Islam do then? that was unusual for its time was limit the number to 4. Now, let's look at, so when we talk about polygamy, you have to understand it in its context, okay? If you are apprehensive that you will not be able to do justice to the orphans, you may marry 2 or 3 or 4 women whom you choose, okay? So what was this measure originally meant to be? Not, I married 4 women because the first one is becoming, complains too much or isn't as attractive as she used to be, okay? That was not the justification. The justification now, we have to understand the historical context. The Muslim community in Medina, remember when it was just a religion of one city, was very small. And remember the battle I mentioned in which the Muslims lost. What did that mean? A lot of male combatants had died and left orphans. Now, technically not orphans because the wives were still alive, right? Now, in order that there would be some kind of social welfare mechanism, what was permitted, because remember, Muhammad originally was trying to limit polygamy, was an exemption, and we see this in the Quran, to take care of the widows of this battle and the children who are destitute as a result of losing their breadwinner, so to speak. It was allowed for a man to marry up to 4 women, but now look at this caveat that often gets forgotten. But you could only marry 4 women if you could do justice to them. In other words, what does justice mean then? Treating everyone equal. In other words, if you have your house for your first wife, you have to provide a similar accommodation for the second, third, or fourth wife. And then also give them the same financial allowance. Now look what the Quran says. If you cannot do this, then marry only 1 wife. Okay. So do you see the caveats, right? And this is what gets kind of forgotten in our imagination of the sultans with his multiple, with his harems, so on and so forth. Polygamy was allowed, and it was limited, keep in mind, due to a specific historical circumstance. In the Muslim world today, polygamy is rare. It only exists as a phenomenon in one country, where it's also seen as kind of an antiquated tradition by those Muslims who are not citizens of that country. It's really only widely practiced in Saudi Arabia today. And of course, in Saudi Arabia, which is kind of awash in oil wealth, yes, men there can afford to have 4 wives and treat them equally in terms of financial support. Now, with emotional support, of course, that's something you can't monetize. And of course, by no means does a man give all 4 wives equal emotional support. But so here you understand the historical context in which this provision was allowed. And then now you also understand its current, modern, contemporary context, that it is an institution that is rarely practiced. Some Muslim countries, such as Tunisia or Turkey, make it illegal to have more than 1 wife. So it's not only is it not practiced across the Muslim world, there are some countries that in their constitution do forbid it. Okay. That's the important thing to understand about polygamy. So that deals with kind of myth number 1. Okay, number 2, and this is going to be a theme we're going to be talking about for the rest of the class. That one distinguishing element that I alluded to earlier, the veil. The veil, of course, is that one obvious signifier of what distinguishes a Muslim woman from a Christian woman, a Jewish woman, a secular woman. Now, if we look at this Quranic phrase, what is it saying? Believing men should lower their gaze and guard their modesty. In other words, it's incumbent upon men to not ogle women, to make catcalls, to be respectful in the presence of a woman. In one word, if we use modern day parlance, to give a woman her private space, if you will. Now, of course, let's look at the biblical references. Women are to dress modestly, not to elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes. Okay. Now, this we see is these kind of kind of responsibilities upon the Christian woman would be the same upon Muslim women, that they should too not adorn themselves with elaborate hairstyles, gold or pearls or expensive clothes. Now, look at the word adorn themselves, okay? And the phrase that follows. In Arabic, that would be translated as the word zina. And zina should be avoided. Now, look where it says when it refers to the word veil. Now, here's an important distinction. The veil in the original Quranic Arabic is the word khimar, not hijab. And this is where women should draw their veils over their bosoms and not display their beauty except to their husbands. Now, this is where it gets tricky, okay? In other words, okay, so you display veils over your bosoms. Okay, in other words, you can't go out without a top. Now, that's not just in the Quranic verses. Okay. Where can you go topless in the United States, for example, or anywhere else in the world? In other words, that's a requirement made of most secular countries today. In pre-Islamic times, though, think it's a hot desert. Yeah, it was not, women did go bare-breasted, at least in kind of, let's say, long desert journeys, for example. And so that's why this verse comes up, okay. Now, Arabic doesn't have commas, right? But then here, there should be a comma, right? Not display their beauty. Now, this is a question. What do they mean by beauty, except to their husbands, their fathers, their husband, fathers, their sons, their husbands, sons, or brothers, sons? Not display their beauty except to their husbands, their fathers. All right. Now let me get out of the way. Okay. In other words, don't strike your feet in order to draw attention to your ornaments. In other words, I guess this was an old practice back then, where you struck your feet to gather a man's, to gain a man's attention. In other words, where can you kind of dress in the presence where you can be yourself? Well, in front of your husband. And small children, right? Okay, then let's look at verses that deal with gender. The Lord responds, I never fail to reward any worker among you for any work you do. Be you male or female, you are equal to another. Now, this is quite unique. Look at how the Quranic verses mention. Those who lead a righteous life, male or female, while believing, they will enter heaven. O people, we created you from the same male and female. So on 3 separate occasions now, the Quran refers to male, kind of an equality, not necessarily equity, but an equality between male and females. Finally, what does this verse do? Well, this is the verse in which it addresses female infanticide. Okay? And thus offering this verse would then explain why such practices need to be abandoned. What sin did the girl who was buried alive commit? Okay, now I'm going to show you 2 videos, both dealing with gendered aspects of Islam. So first, let's go to a crash course in history.
Very important. The northern part of Arabia was sandwiched between the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Sasanian Empire. And you'll remember, those guys were always fighting. They were like snowboarders and skiers, or like the Westboro Baptist Church and everyone else. At its core, Islam is what we call a radical reforming religion. Just as Jesus and Moses sought to restore Abrahamic monotheism after what they perceived as straying, so too did Muhammad. Muslims believe that God sent Muhammad as the final prophet to bring people back to the one true religion, which involves the worship of and submission to a single and all-powerful God. The Quran also acknowledges Abraham and Moses and Jesus, among others, as prophets, but it's very different from the Hebrew and Christian Bibles. For one thing, it's much less narrative, but also it's the written record of the revelations Muhammad received, which means it's not written from the point of view of people. It is seen as the actual word of God. The Quran is a really broad-ranging text, but it returns again and again to a couple themes. One is strict monotheism, and the other is the importance of taking care of those less fortunate than you. The Quran says of the good person, spends his substance however much he himself may cherish it, upon his near of kin and the orphans and the needy and the wayfarer and the beggars, and for the freeing of human beings from bondage. These revelations also radically increase the rights of women and orphans, which is one of the reasons that Muhammad's tribal leaders weren't that psyched about them. To talk more about Islamic faith and practice, let's go to the thought bubble. The 5 pillars of Islam are the basic acts considered obligatory, at least by Sunni Muslims. First is the Shahada, or the profession of faith. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is God's prophet, which is sometimes translated as there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is Allah's prophet, which tries to make Muslims sound other and ignores the fact that the Arabic word for God, whether you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim, is Allah. Second, Salah, or ritual prayer 5 times a day, at dawn, noon, afternoon, sunset, and late evening, which are obligatory unless you haven't hit puberty, are too sick, or are menstruating. Keep it PG, thought bubble. Third, Psalm, the month-long fast during the month of Ramadan, in which Muslims do not eat or drink or smoke cigarettes during daylight hours. Since Ramadan is a lunar calendar month, it moves around the seasons, and obviously it's most fun during the winter, when the days are shorter, and least fun during the summer, when days are both long and hot. Fourth is Zakat, or almsgiving, in which non-poor Muslims are required to give a percentage of their income to the poor. And lastly, Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that Muslims must try to fulfill at least once in their lives, provided they are healthy and have enough money. And there's also more to understanding Islam than just knowing the Quran. Like Judaism with its Talmud and Christianity with its lives of saints and writings of church fathers, Islam has supplementary sacred texts, chief among which is the Hadith, a collection of sayings and stories about the Prophet. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Oh, it's time for the open letter? Magic! An open letter to the 72 virgins. Oh, but first let's check what's in the secret compartment. Oh, it's Andre the Giant. Did you know that Andre the Giant died a virgin? Is a fact that I made up? Dear 72 virgins, hey there, it's me, John Green. Did you know that not all hadiths were created equal? Some sayings of the Prophet are really well sourced, like for instance, a good friend or a relative heard the Prophet say something and then it ended up as a hadith. But some hadiths are terribly sourced, like not to be irreverent, but some of it is like middle school gossip, like Rachel told Rebecca that her sister's brother's friend kissed Justin Bieber on the face. And the vast majority of Muslims don't treat terribly sourced hadiths as scripture. And the idea that you go to heaven and get 72 virgins is not in the Quran, it's in a terribly sourced hadith, so it is my great regret to inform you, 72 virgins, that in the eyes of almost all Muslims, you do not exist. Best wishes, John Green. One more thing about Islam. Like Christianity and Judaism, it has a body of law. You might have heard of it. It's called Sharia. Although we tend to think of Sharia as a single set of laws that all Muslims follow, that's ridiculous. There are numerous competing ideas about Sharia, just as there are within any legal tradition. So people who embraced this worldview were called Muslims because they submitted to the will of God, and they became part of the Ummah, or community of believers. This would be a good moment for an Uma Thurman joke, but sadly, she is no longer famous. I'm sorry if you're watching this, Uma Thurman. Being part of the Ummah trumped all other ties, including tribal ties, which got Muhammad into some trouble and brings us, at last, back to history. So as Muhammad's following in Mecca grew, the Ummah aroused the suspicion of the most powerful tribe in Mecca, the Quraysh. And it didn't matter that Muhammad himself was born into the Quraysh tribe, because he wouldn't shut up about how there was only one God, which was really bad news to the Quraysh tribe, because they managed the pilgrimage trade in Mecca, and if all those gods were false, it would be a disaster economically. Although, come to think of it, in the end, the Meccan pilgrimage business turned out just fine. So the Quraysh forced Muhammad and his followers out of Mecca in 622 CE, and they headed to Yathrib, also known as Medina. This journey, also known as the Hijra, is so important that it marks year 0 in the Islamic.
Okay, you can watch the rest of that video on your own if you're interested in learning more. I just wanted to show the reference. I wanted you to pay particular notice to the reference of the 72 virgins, which then brings up the other significance of this class. Here we're studying a subject that's not just about gender in a particular place and time. We're studying about a gender topic that's also very politicized. You see, in the aftermath of 9/11, the fate of Muslim women became not just something that was of concern due to humanitarian reasons. Let's say the fate of Muslim women under the Taliban in Afghanistan, which was abysmal and abhorrent. Prior to 9/11, the US didn't really do anything about the condition of women there. After 9/11, the fate of Afghan women and then all Muslim women became a kind of motif. These women have to be saved from their Taliban captors, which of course they had abhorrent conditions, right? But you see, then it becomes politicized. You are really saying we want to save the women of Afghanistan. Now, is it for really the sake of saving the women of Afghanistan, or providing a rationale, a narrative, a justification for the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11? Soon this grows into a narrative of Muslim women need saving, and thus it becomes politicized. The other area becomes politicized is, of course, the mention of how terrorists, suicide bombers dying for Al-Qaeda were promised 72 virgins in heaven. This spread a myth that this was a kind of widespread mainstream Muslim belief. What does John Green tell us? No, the source of that myth is a very poorly sourced hadith. Okay. Now, also remember, this is a myth spread by men for men. It's basically spread by men who want to get young men to kill themselves. And how do you get a young man to kill himself? Say, you die in the name of our cause. Of course, they're going to call it a Muslim cause. Die in the name of our cause. In the afterlife, you'll get 72 virgins. Do you see it? But that's a very gendered promise. That's why I said it was a promise made by men to young men. Because then what happened relatively recently, but after 9/11, you had the phenomena of female suicide bombers. What were they promised? Were they promised 72 virgins? Okay. And if so, what would that look like? Would these women get 72 computer geeks in heaven? Okay. In other words, do you see there's something wrong with the logic of this promise? And it also demonstrates that this was a very kind of liminal, not very mainstream belief that was, what's the word? That was, anyway, that was manipulated. There you go. That's not the word I was looking for, but was manipulated basically to get young men to kill themselves. The next video I'm going to show you is also addressing that theme. Okay, so this is a TED Talk. And it's a good, this is a very good description of what is the essence of the Quran? And what about that 72 virgin myths? In other words, this TED Talk is very much a product of its post 9/11 time. And what do we call that, by the way? For some of you might be new to the history field. When current times conditions the way we look at the past, that's called the historiography. The study of how current times shapes the way we view the past, historiography. Okay.
You may have heard about the Quran's idea of paradise being 72 virgins, and I promise I will come back to those virgins. But in fact, here in the Northwest, we're living very close to the real Quranic idea of paradise, defined 36 times as gardens watered by running streams. Since I live in a houseboat on the running stream of Lake Union, this makes perfect sense to me. But the thing is, how come it's news to most people? I know many well-intentioned non-Muslims who've begun reading the Quran but given up, disconcerted by its otherness. The historian Thomas Carlyle considered Muhammad one of the world's greatest heroes, yet even he called the Quran as toilsome reading as I ever undertook, a wearisome, confused jumble. Part of the problem, I think, is that we imagine that the Quran can be read as we usually read a book, as though we can curl up with it on a rainy afternoon with a bowl of popcorn within reach, as though God, and the Quran is entirely in the voice of God speaking to Muhammad, were just another author on the bestseller list. Yet the fact that so few people do actually read the Quran is precisely why it's so easy to quote. That is, to misquote. Phrases and snippets taken out of context in what I call the highlighter version, which is the one favored by both Muslim fundamentalists and anti-Muslim Islamophobes. So this past spring, as I was gearing up to begin writing a biography of Muhammad, I realized I needed to read the Quran properly as I could, that is. My Arabic's reduced by now to wielding a dictionary, so I took 4 well-known translations and decided to read them side by side, verse by verse, along with a transliteration and the original 7th century Arabic. Now, I did have an advantage. My last book was about the story behind the Shia-Sunni split, and for that I'd worked closely with the earliest Islamic histories, so I knew the events to which the Quran constantly refers, its frame of reference. I knew enough, that is, to know that I'd be a tourist in the Quran, an informed one, an experienced one even, but still an outsider, an agnostic Jew reading someone else's holy book. So I read slowly. I'd set aside 3 weeks for this project, and that, I think, is what is meant by hubris, because it turned out to be 3 months. I did resist the temptation to skip to the back where the shorter, more clearly mystical chapters are, but every time I thought I was beginning to get a handle on the Quran, that feeling of, I get it now, it'd slip away overnight, and I'd come back in the morning wondering if I wasn't lost in a strange land. And yet the terrain was very familiar. The Quran declares that it comes to renew the message of the Torah and the Gospels, so 1/3 of it reprises the stories of biblical figures like Abraham, Moses, Joseph, Mary, Jesus. God himself was utterly familiar from his earlier manifestation as Yahweh, jealously insisting on no other gods. The presence of camels, mountains, desert wells, and springs took me back to the year I spent wandering the Sinai desert. And then there was the language, the rhythmic cadence of it, reminding me of evenings spent listening to Bedouin elders recite hours-long narrative poems entirely from memory. And I began to grasp why it's said that the Quran is really the Quran, only in Arabic. Take the Fatiha, the 7-verse opening chapter that is the Lord's Prayer and the Shema Israel of Islam combined. It's just 29 words in Arabic, but anywhere from 65 to 72 in translation. And yet the more you add, the more seems to go missing. The Arabic has an incantatory, almost hypnotic quality that begs to be heard rather than read, felt more than analyzed. It wants to be chanted out loud, to sound its music in the ear and on the tongue. So the Quran in English is a kind of shadow of itself, or as Arthur Arbery called his version, an interpretation. But all is not lost in translation. As the Quran promises, patience is rewarded, and there are many surprises. A degree of environmental awareness, for instance, and of humans as mere stewards of God's creation, unmatched in the Bible. And where the Bible is addressed exclusively to men, using the second and third person masculine, the Quran includes women, talking, for instance, of believing men and believing women, honorable men and honorable women. Or take the infamous verse about killing the unbelievers. Yes, it does say that, but in a very specific context. The anticipated conquest of the sanctuary city of Mecca, where fighting was usually forbidden. And the permission comes hedged about with qualifiers. Not you must kill unbelievers in Mecca, but you are allowed to, but only after a grace period is over. And only if there's no other pact in place. And only if they try to stop you getting to the Kaaba. And only if they attack you first. And even then, God is merciful, forgiveness is supreme, and so, essentially, better if you don't. This was perhaps the biggest surprise. How flexible the Quran is, at least in minds that are not fundamentally inflexible. Some of these verses are definite in meaning, it says, and others are ambiguous. The perverse at heart will seek out the ambiguities, trying to create discord by pinning down meanings of their own. Only God knows the true meaning. The phrase, God is subtle, appears again and again. And indeed, the whole of the Quran is far more subtle than most of us have been led to believe, as in, for instance, that little matter of virgins and paradise. Old-fashioned Orientalism comes into play here. The word used 4 times is huris, rendered as dark-eyed maidens with swelling breasts, or as fair, high-bosomed virgins. Yet all there is in the original Arabic is that one word, huris. Not a swelling breast or high bosom in sight. Now, this may be a way of saying pure beings, like in angels, or it may be like the Greek kos, or kore, an eternal youth. But the truth is, nobody really knows, and that's the point. Because the Quran is quite clear when it says that you will be a new creation in paradise, and that you will be recreated in a form unknown to you, which seems to me a far more appealing prospect than a virgin. And that number 72 never appears. There are no 72 virgins in the Quran. That idea only came into being 300 years later, and most Islamic scholars see it as the equivalent of people with wings sitting on clouds and strumming harps. Paradise is quite the opposite. It's not virginity, it's fecundity, it's plenty, it's gardens watered by running streams. Thank you.
Okay, so that is Leslie Hazelton dealing with the that particular myth. So if we go back to the presentation. Let's deal with just one more video dealing with the Quran itself. Okay. Watch the following. It was an experiment done in the Netherlands.
Door de recente gebeurtenissen in Parijs en de associatie tussen ISIS en de islam ligt het islamitische geloof steeds vaker onder vuur. Zo worden moslims ervan beschuldigd dat hun geloof niet aansluit op onze westerse idealen. Maar hoe zit het dan eigenlijk met het christendom? Het geloof waarop onze cultuur grotendeels gebouwd is.
Een vrouw moet zich laten onderwijzen in stilheid, in alle onderdanigheid.
Volgens dit hele boek is de vrouw in principe onderdanig. Voor dit experiment hebben we een Bijbel gekocht en deze omgetoverd tot een Koran. Hierin hebben we schokkende passages gehighlight die sterk in contrast staan met onze westerse normen en waarden. Eens kijken wat er gebeurt als we de citaten uit de Bijbel voorleggen aan de mensen op straat, maar ze in de veronderstelling laten dat ze uit de Koran komen.
Als u mijn verordeningen verwerpt en als uw ziel van mijn bepalingen walgt, u zult dan het vlees van uw eigen zonen eten en het vlees van uw eigen dochters zult u eten. Want ik sta niet toe dat een vrouw onderwijs geeft. Dan moet u haar hand afhakken. Laat uw oog haar niet ontzien. Wanneer een man met een andere man slaapt, zij moeten zeker tot de dood gebracht worden.
Wat is jullie eerste reactie? Klinkt echt belachelijk.
Nou, ik wist eigenlijk helemaal niet dat dit ook erin stond.
Hoe kan je hierin geloven? Ongelooflijk vind ik dat eigenlijk.
Handen afhakken en zo, ja, zo zijn zij blijkbaar, maar ik...
Als je vanaf je geboorte al zo wordt opgevoed met zulke gedachten, dan ga je toch op een bepaalde manier denken.
Dit komt over alsof ze weer willen onderdrukken en willen onderwerpen aan hun geloof.
Die vrouw wil helpen en als dank wordt de hand afgehakt, dus...
Ja, zo is het.
Ja.
En dat is niet goed, hè?
Nee.
Als je dit nou naast de Bijbel zou zetten, wat zijn dan voor jou de grootste verschillen?
Ik vind de Koran, zeg maar, als ik dit zo hoor, die vind ik iets agressiever met de hak de hand eraf.
Ik denk dat de Bijbel toch ook positieve dingen heeft.
Ze vertellen het anders, in ieder geval.
Het grote verschil is toch wel hier, wat hier ook expliciet blijkt uit veel meer de rol van de vrouw.
In de Bijbel staat er iets minder hard erop, gewoon iets vredeachtiger.
Ja, de wereld verandert en ik vind dat ze toch wel een beetje daarmee mee moeten gaan.
De meeste mensen van ons hebben gewoon vrijheid van keuze en vrijheid van meningsuiting gehad. Ja. En daardoor ga je op een andere manier denken. Ik
vind het erg dat wat ooit opgeschreven is, men als de waarheid ziet.
Maar zou je dit boek dan niet gewoon weg kunnen laten?
Nou ja, het is al heel oud, hè, dus het hoort er een beetje bij, ja.
Nou, dan hebben we een kleine verrassing voor jou. Want deze prachtige zinnen uit de Koran, die kwamen gewoon rustig uit de Bijbel.
What the fuck? Serieus?
Ja, wat de hel.
Zo, dat had ik niet gedacht.
Nee?
Dat had ik echt niet gedacht, nee.
Heel mooi verwoorden. Dit is echt ziek. Dit is echt ziek.
Meen je dat? Ja. Dat hebben we heel goed gedaan. Niet verward.
Ja, nee?
Het zijn alleen maar vooroordelen. En ik zeg altijd van, je moet niet vooroordelen, maar zelf doe ik het ook alleen maar. En het is iets wat je niet bewust doet.
Het heeft alles met de media te maken natuurlijk.
Ik blijf er gewoon bij, blijf gewoon rationeel nadenken. Ja. Kijk gewoon wat een beetje logisch is en doe er je voordeel mee.
Tuurlijk heb ik vroeger ook bijbelverhalen gehoord en ik heb zelf op christelijke school gezeten. Maar nee, ik had niet verwacht dat dit erin stond. Nee.
Vond je nou een interessante video? Vergeet hem niet te liken en te delen.
En heb je nou een mening over dit onderwerp? Reageer dan hieronder even op de video.
Tot de volgende keer.
Okay. So on one level, what do videos like this do? First of all, it raises a question, first of all. Okay. In other words, it's often in kind of our debates, we debate under which religion are women more oppressed, which religion is more inherently violent. And the kind of argument I've been trying to make throughout this course is patriarchy. These patriarchal institutions, these practices of patriarchy, are kind of a historical phenomena that existed outside of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam before they came into face of their own. In other words, these are practices in the Roman Empire, which for the longest time until the year 300 was not Christian. Later, the state religion became Christianity. But then ancient Iran, which is neither Christian nor Jewish nor Muslim, in ancient Iran was following the Zoroastrian faith. Or let's say in ancient Egypt. Patriarchy existed in all of these places. You see, when we judge the Quran, or in that particular video, the Bible, both New and Old Testaments, by today's secular Western standards, they seem outdated. They seem antiquated. They seem oppressive. But the point is, you have to realize there's a continuity. It's not to pick on the Bible, the Quran, the Talmud, okay? Rather, it is to say that there's been a historical phenomenon. And then remember the very first lecture where I showed how women were treated, let's say in the medieval Christian Europe, for example. So in history, what do we have to do? We have to realize, we have to appreciate that, okay? Not to judge a particular historical period with our modern eyes. But at the same time, realize where injustice occurs. Let's take Afghanistan. And then pinpoint what is the source of the injustice. Because in a lot of cases, the injustice or patriarchy that women face might be justified by Islam. But remember I say it's important to make patriarchy a verb, because religion is just a set of abstract ideas. They exist in scriptures. It's up to men to interpret them. And men will interpret what suits their power and what will keep them in relative power vis-a-vis women. And so this is why we have to bear all of this in mind. When we talk, is the Middle East today patriarchal? Absolutely. Is a result of religious scripture. Every human has the agency to interpret scripture. And we see there is some scripture that is very kind of pro-women in the Quran. In other words, we have to realize that this is a human act. Usually, in this case, men appropriating the scripture that suits their interest best to dominate women. That's my argument. It's up to me now to demonstrate this for the remainder of the semester. Okay, so then what about the other source of religious, the other source of religious tradition? Okay, you have the Quran, which is supposed to be directly revealed from God by Gabriel to Muhammad. Then you have the hadith, which are represented, and they're distinct, okay? In theory, the Gospels are kind of a form of hadith. You are writing down what Jesus said a couple of generations after. Okay? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Remember, those are the Gospels attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We're not sure if they're the actual authors. And they're not the original 12 apostles. So in other words, they're a form of hadith. There is a chain saying, according to so-and-so, this is what Jesus said. According to the book of Mark, this is what Jesus said in his lifetime. According to the book of Luke, John, and so on and so forth. So let's look at various hadith. Okay. So what did Muhammad say before his death, his last sermon? People, it is true you have rights with regard to your woman, but they also have right over you. If they abide by your right, then to them belongs the right to be fed and clothed in kindness. Do treat women well and be kind to them, for they are your partners and committed helpers. It's not saying men and women are equal. That's a very modern idea. But for its time, now keep in mind, it's 632 AD. This is radically unusual. It is radically, in a kind of sense, empowering. It's an empowerment of women's role in society. Now look at this in terms of the rules of combat. And what exists here is kind of a form of a pre-modern Geneva Conventions. Geneva Conventions, yeah? Rules of combat. You must not mutilate dead bodies. You cannot kill a child, nor a woman. In other words, nor an aged man. Now look at this. Bring no harm to the trees. Don't burn them with fire, especially which are fruitful. So here's a code of warfare that says basically no collateral damage, no environmental damage. Now you might say, didn't Al-Qaeda violate all those rules? Doesn't ISIS violate all those rules? Absolutely. And that's what a lot of mainstream Muslims would find repulsive about both terrorist groups. It's the reason why these are fringe terrorist groups. ISIS recruited a lot of people, but still, if you look at the numbers at its height, maybe 100,000 out of 1 billion, still a fringe movement. And of course, Muslims challenged ISIS. If you look at this meme, this was created by Muslims to people who might be supportive of ISIS in the Muslim world. Basically, you read between the lines, okay? Look at all the qualifications. And then finally, the last one, you cannot force Islam. You cannot force somebody to convert. Other examples of hadith. So again, this is the way a hadith works. It has been narrated on the authority of Abu Huraira that heard Muhammad, Rasulullah is just a reference to Muhammad, that believers who show the most perfect faith are those who have the best character, and the best of you are those who are the best to their wives, okay? He who had 2 wives and was biased towards one, ignoring the other, is going to be raised on the day of judgment with one of his body, half of his body missing. Don't bear enmity against a believing woman. If you dislike one character, be pleased with another. Now look at this phrase regarding kind of this notion of heaven being under the feet of the mother in sentence number 4. Now, even the adulteress, even though he said adultery is forbidden following the Mosaic tradition, in other words, Judaic law, think in Jesus' lifetime, right? Now look at this case though. An adulteress was forgiven who passed by a dog at the well. The dog was holding out its tongue from thirst, which was near killing him. The adulteress took off her boot, tied it to the end of her garment, and drew water for the dog and gave him to drink. And she was forgiven for the act of committing adultery. So this is kind of like an equivalent to the parables of Jesus, for example. I'm supposed to get this video. It's no longer on the internet. But this is also now kind of, we're jumping to the present, some of the most ridiculous ways that religious scholars also kind of interpret the faith. Okay. Now, we're going to jump to Saudi Arabia later. But look at what this article that I sent you from the Washington Post saying. What's happened to Islam in the 1970s? It took a religious churn, almost like the United States. When the counterculture emerged in the 1960s, you know, hippies and peace and Woodstock, it also fueled a kind of Christian counterculture to the free love movement. The same thing happened by Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, fueled by fuel money. Now keep in mind, who is writing this article is a Muslim woman. Started to translate the Quran, and a lot gets lost in translation, right? But the Quran that justified domestic violence, for example. And just think about this when we jump to Saudi Arabia. The ultra-traditional interpretation of Islam is known as the Wahhabi ideology that Nomani refers to. In the various forms would also be the ideology that infused a group like ISIS. Okay, look at this article by Mira in the Wall Street Journal. And that also talks about kind of a fervor, a kind of return to a fundamentalist creed as well, along with the rise of Saudi Arabia. And what does this article in the reading do? It helps you understand a peculiar phenomenon. You see, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was not usual for women to wear the veil in the Muslim world. Something happened. We think this is a long time tradition. No. The predominance or phenomena of women wearing the veil really took off in the late 70s. That's why all these articles are trying to address. Okay? Another Muslim woman named Lamia who's writing. She is a Muslim woman who doesn't write a headscarf, right? Now, what is her problem is this. It's mostly older men, learned or unlearned, who assume the right to determine how a woman should appear. But there's no theological or sociological foundation for this. What did we realize so far? The Quran, like the Bible and the Torah before it, they're not kind of encyclopedias with diagrams. You see, in the Quran, there's nothing that says this is how a modest woman should appear with a diagram showing her hair must be covered. Then you have to understand, this is the debate that continues among Muslim women. Is the veil mandatory? To this very day, there's no consensus. Now, at the end of the day, what do I say? That let it be a debate amongst Muslim women. Muslim men really shouldn't have a role to play in this debate. This is going to be a debate that should be decided by Muslim women or Muslim women. As a general rule, if a Muslim woman feels comfortable and believes she's following her faith by wearing the veil, all power to her. Same with a religious woman who decides not to wear the veil. Again, all power to her. However, when a state like Saudi Arabia forces women to veil and says this is Islamic law, that's not an individual choice by a believing woman. That is patriarchy of the state, using what? Religious patriarchy, number one, as a justification. And this is a good place to pause. We talked about two prominent women, Khadija and Fatima. In our third and final part of this week, we'll talk about two other prominent women in Islamic history, Aisha and Fatima.